One of the challenges that we come across with AO1 questions is how to tackle questions that cover a very long time span. And there are two areas where we might see this as an issue. We see it in the Britain paper because it's going from 1918 to 1979, but also we see it in the warfare paper because that's covering a period from around 1793 right up until 1918. So it's about creating that balance between evidence and knowledge, but also how do we combine that with sufficient analysis. So we're going to have a look at a specific question. How accurate is it to say that living standards saw sustained improvement in the years 1918 to 1979? So this is covering the entire Britain time span. Not all questions will. Some of them might cover a period, say, 1918 to 1945, or they might cover the post-war period. But the biggest challenges are where it covers a very long time span, because you've got absolutely masses of evidence that you could actually include in this question. With this question, it does raise some other issues that you need to be aware of. And that's about having a really solid understanding of key terms, that you can define key terms. Because in this question, it's about living standards, and it's going to be very difficult to tackle this question if you don't have a clear understanding of what living standards actually entails. Living standards is in theme 4, which is part of the quality of life theme. But it does have its own unique definition. And traditionally, you would define living standards in terms of wages and employment, access to consumer goods, and access to good quality housing as well. Because living standards is something quite fundamental. It's not, can you go out to the cinema? Can you get access to a car? It's suggesting something more fundamental than that. There's also a danger with this one to drift into theme 2, which is the development of the welfare state. You can do it like that. Healthcare, you could say, is fundamental, but this is how you would normally define living standards. So if you need that clear definition to tackle this question. The other part of this question that you need to think about is what sustained improvement actually looks like, and this is where it's going to help you build in deeper analysis. And I've given you some suggestions for this question. It would vary according to question, but on this one, if you wanted to look at sustained improvement, you could think about, well, does it happen across the whole country? Is everywhere experiencing improvements in their living standards? Is it for all classes, or is one class particularly improving their standard of living? Gender is one we can apply to this question as well. Not so much, but we'll come across that in a moment. And importantly, is it evenly paced across the time period? Because if we look at living standards, there are definite pockets where it declines. So if we think about the 1930s and the Depression, we could also think about the 1970s when we've got periods of high inflation. But then we have got periods of where living standards are rapidly improving, 1930s particularly, but only for the middle classes. And then we look at the 1950s as well. I think about Harold Macmillan saying Britain had never had it so good. So that discussion and that acknowledgement of what sustained improvement looks like is the way that you're going to help build in nuance or deeper analysis. So if I think about my criteria here on the left-hand side, well, how would I evaluate it? What would be the key evaluative and analytical points I would want to mention? If we think about wages and employment, think about the whole time period. Well, yeah, it did improve over the entire time period. People's disposable incomes did continue to improve. But of course, those are averages. And overall, although they did continue to increase, there were periods of mass unemployment, peaking at 3 million in about 1932. And not everyone had access to improvements in wages and employment. You could think about the Jarrow March, where they didn't have access to jobs. And industrial areas of Britain where there was high unemployment. We'll come to the last column in a moment, but if we go down to our second criteria, access to consumer goods, what would be my points, my main analytical points I would want to make? Well, because of wages, and we can make that link with wages and employment, people had greater access to consumer goods. However, if we think about that change over time, in the interwar period, the improvements were mostly for the middle classes. I'm thinking specifically about the car here, and the cost of the car coming down to about a year's wage for the average middle class consumer. The benefits for the working class probably aren't going to be seen until the post-war era as the consumer credit laws are relaxed. But again, we're going to see regional variations as we did with wages and employment. But this is where we can build in gender, because it's women that were particularly benefiting from two consumer goods. If we went into the 1930s, they benefited from the growth of the radio because it ended the isolation of being in the home all the time. And then if we went into the post-war era, particularly in the 1950s, we've got the growth of labour-saving devices, which allowed them, freed up their time, allowed them to go out to work. Our third criteria, access to housing. Again, we've got a difference between the interwar period and the post-war period. In the interwar period, it was very much an expansion of private homes for the middle classes. Building on the Addison Housing Act of 1919 or the Wheatley Housing Act of 1924, the acceleration doesn't really happen for the working class until post-World War II, when the Blitz had eradicated a lot of the slum housing. But over the whole entire period, there is always a shortage of good quality housing, and it is, as I've put there, variable quality. By the late 1960s, the 70s, because of the shortage of housing, the government resorts to this idea of homes in the sky, the high-rise buildings. But they came with their own issues, such as antisocial behaviour, increasing crime rates, because of the way that they were built, and isolation as well, because it was breaking down the traditional terraced housing where you would see far stronger communities being built. So you'll notice that in my plan here, I haven't really put any evidence at all. My evidence is going to be to support those evaluative statements that I'm trying to make. So if I think about my opening sentence to each paragraph, this is absolutely key to avoid drifting into that narrative, explaining what happened or narrating, describing what happens in each of these categories. Having a strong opening sentence will drive your paragraph and keep you focused on the analysis. If you have a strong opening sentence, you then need to just spend the rest of that paragraph justifying your analytical statement. So for wages, and particularly disposable income, did see an improvement between 1918 and 1979, but this improvement was tempered by periods of high unemployment and rising inflation, and the improvement was not regionally equal. So I'm giving the reader a very clear direction that I'm going with my paragraph. With access to consumer goods, as wages and employment fluctuated, so I almost made that link with the previous paragraph, so did access to consumer goods, although women in particular would see a sustained improvement across the time period. And finally, access to housing. Access to good quality, affordable housing was defined by class throughout much of the time period. So you can have a go at testing out an approach to breadth questions. I've given you 4 examples here of questions that cover a very long time period. Some of them are from past exam papers. And you can do one of 3 things. You could write the entire essay. You could do a plan similar to the previous slide, but do that final step of adding in the additional precise evidence that would support those analytical statements. Or finally, you could write out the introduction and write out the opening sentences of each paragraph.